Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar tonight. I think we've got around maybe 50 people here tonight with us, so that's quite a nice number for a very specific topic. As you might know, this is the last part of our mini-series of 3 parts of webinars. So thank you very much for all the committed ones that are with us for the whole, for all of the parts, and also welcome to all the new people that joined us tonight. This series is brought to you as a collaboration with Plant Life and PONT. My name is Lucia Chmurova, and I'm the Conservation Officer for Magnificent Meadows Wales project, and I'll be chairing the session tonight. So just very quickly about Plant Life and PONT. Apologies to all those that heard this 3 times now, but it's the compulsory spiel. So Plant Life is the conservation charity that is working towards conservation of wild plants. This also includes fungi and things like mosses and ferns, wildflowers. We are working all across the country. So if you wanted to check out any of the kind of current campaigns like Normal May or Every Flower Counts survey, do visit the website. Our project is called Magnificent Meadows Wales, and we are a 3-year project based in Wales and funded by the Welsh Government. We are all about meadows, as the name suggests, and we are working towards a restoration and creation of meadows on lots of different scales. So we work with National Trust as our main partner, working on big restoration scale projects all across the country, but also working on smaller scale things like working with lots of communities and hospitals and schools on creating mini meadows. And another big partner in our project is Centre for Sustainable Healthcare. So we are also working a lot with the hospitals on green routes, for example, with them. So this webinar we are hosting with PONT. So PONT work across Wales with those in farming, conservation, community groups or individuals, and work with them to come up with practical grazing solutions. And these are working for all into benefit of animals, nature and people involved. And they do this by offering a range of professional, advisory, educational and community engagement services. So we had a different member of PONT with us for every part. We've got Jan Cherry with us tonight as the lead speaker for PONT. Jan leads the ecological side of PONT's advisory work, including supporting the production of grazing plans, licenses and reports, and undertaking ecological surveys and habitat monitoring. And previously, Jan worked with Natural Resources Wales for 15 years as a heathland ecologist. So she'll start off our program tonight with an overview to current grassland state. And then we also have 3 other panelists and speakers tonight, and I will leave Jan to introduce those. And they'll be also staying with us for the end of the session for Q&A at the end. So just a few technicalities for those who haven't used Zoom before, if there is anyone like that these days. Throughout the whole session, you can ask us questions, so you can see the chat and the Q&A option in your bar at the bottom. So if you can please use the Q&A box for specific questions that you might have to our panelists. And if you can keep the chat to the chat, it's then a bit easier to pick out the questions for me if you put them in the Q&A box for us. We do also have a couple of helpers with us tonight, the one from PONT, one from Plant Life, Emma and Tamsin, who will be keeping conversation going on the chat and putting in some useful links for you throughout the session as well. I think that's it really for the technical bits as well. So Jan, over to you now.
Hi there, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. I'll just share my screen and let's see if you can tell me if it's working.
Yeah, that's good, Jan, now.
Okay, so I'm just going to give you a brief overview of where we are with grasslands in relevance to Wales today, and then a little bit of background about different types of grasslands and the problems that we at PONT encounter in our daily work. Not going to go into too much details, although I'll say a little bit more about coastal grasslands at the end, and I'll waymark you towards the other speakers because some of what they say is relevant to what I'm talking about. So first of all, I'm looking at the current status of lowland grasslands in Wales. Can everyone see that? Maybe a thumbs up from the people. You've got that now? Yeah. So this comes from the State of Natural Resources Report 2020, which has just been produced by NRW. And I suggest if you really want to look in detail, go to that online. This is just some headlines. So they found there was a continued loss of semi-natural grasslands from sample surveys. So the actual, you know, we thought possibly that actual loss had stopped probably in the 80s, 90s, but it is still continuing. Of 72% of grassland SSSIs are unfavourable, and what's interesting is that 80% of those, it's undermanagement, and this is lowland grasslands, as I say. Undermanagement is the main cause of condition. And the conclusions from the NRW was that ecosystem resilience for lowland grasslands is poor for all factors: diversity, extent, condition, and connectivity. So future prospects they describe as poor, or at best mixed, which is not a particularly rosy picture. So they listed a number of potential responses, and I picked out two which I think are really relevant to us and what we're doing. And the first one is sustainable land management and multiple benefits. And I think that's what these seminars have really been about. It's about how we manage these grassland habitats, working with farmers to find ways in which to fit them into the modern farming system so that they can be both economic but also rich in biodiversity, and also looking at new things and new systems and schemes like payment for outcomes and ecosystem services. So I think that's really critical to what we do. And obviously we also do restoration and creation of grasslands, and that's something that plant life is very involved in, and PONT is as well. So I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the types of grasslands and some of the issues we encounter. So my first one is hay meadows. Obviously a beautiful and wonderful part of our countryside, and you know, we have some really lovely meadows, and the Coronation Meadows project was a wonderful start for getting people really engaged in them. But we are increasingly seeing meadows like this, and hopefully that picture will come up soon. What you're seeing is a very impoverished meadow. That was a meadow that not that long ago was really species rich and looked like the first picture, so full of flowers. And the reasons behind this is changing farming systems, sometimes grazing too late in the spring, often early hay cut, so you lose things like the yellow rattle, and also sometimes too much liming or too much farmyard manure, and you almost get a sort of improvement by stealth, really, which means that the meadow changes character. And this means you have to really address the reasons for this happening, and a lot of it comes down to the particular farmers not seeing the meadow as being valuable in their farming system, and this is something we have to engage with a farming community and try and work out why they no longer want that hay or why their system has changed. And there are certainly plenty of farmers who are using hay and some who are extending their hay. So I think there's also a need to kind of best practice and show how other farms are doing it, and try and get people to think about how they can use their hay. For example, there's a real demand for hay good quality hay within the equine industry. And in parts of Wales, we have huge numbers of horses, and there is that demand. So the first thing, if you're going to restore hay, is you've really got to get on board the landowners, the farmers, and get them to really want to have hay meadows, because if they're just being enforced on them, they are not really going to develop in the way that you want. And I think once you've done that and you sort out your grazing, so talk about, grazing is really important in hay meadows. That aftermath grazing is a critical part of the system. Then you can think about restoration, and we're involved in quite a lot of restoration. Hay meadows using hay, locally sourced seed, and this has been done by a commercial company, but you can also do it with volunteers or groups of local people. Can everyone see me still? My internet connection's gone a bit. Yep, you're okay. Thank you. So hay meadow restoration is very much part of what we do and what plant life do. So the next habitat I was going to look at is the marshy grasslands, possibly one of the most difficult, I think, of all grasslands. This is a species-rich grassland which is being managed for marsh artillery, so it's really abundant devil's spit scabious. And these, when they're in this state, they're absolutely fantastic. But I think if you can see my next picture, this is what most of us see now with marshy grasslands. So millennia dominated, very species poor, often a very thick litter layer. And these sorts of grasslands have developed in this way because of historic issues. And some of them, it's going back hundreds of years. It can be burning, it can be pollution from the Industrial Revolution. And the way livestock have changed from having that mix of livestock, including heavy livestock like cattle, to sheep-dominated systems makes it really difficult to manage these millennia grasslands. Now, I'm not going to say any more about millennia because I know Sorcha will be talking about her farm and how she's been tackling millennia. But I will mention juncus grasslands in context of marshy grasslands. Somebody actually asked a question on chat a few weeks ago about whether anything eats juncus. Well, yes, things do eat juncus. This meadow you're looking at here was a juncus dominated site. It's part of a marsh fertility project in South Wales, managed by Amanda Evans. And it was very scrubby. It had very high levels of juncus, very dominated by juncus, and poor floristics. And that was taken in hand. First of all, things like the scrub were managed. Then the juncus was cut and grazing was brought in, and it was winter grazing with ponies, no summer grazing, and continuing to cut the juncus as it became too rank. The result of that is this is now a really floristic sward. So it's got things like the marsh orchid, which you can see at the front, have appeared in the sward, and devil's bits gabius has increased. So you can manage really species poor juncus meadows to become something quite special. And critical to this is excluding sheep during the restoration period. So horses and cattle are brilliant at managing juncus. And that winter grazing and then allowing the sward to flower is really important. That's not to say that in the long term you might not put sheep back in there, but certainly during the restoration phase, if you want to turn something which is a species poor juncus grassland into something like this, then you have to think very carefully about how you manage that grazing regime. The next one I was going to talk about is calcareous grasslands. This is the great orm that Gemma is going to talk about in great detail later. And these are some of our most species-rich grasslands, and they are such a sight when they're in flower. And the orm is probably one of the best examples of this type of grassland. But like many calcareous grasslands, there has been a decrease in grazing. Calcareous grasslands can be sheep grazed really, really successfully, but on sites like the Orm where grazing has declined, this is what you end up with, which is a really thick mass of vegetation and far fewer flowers. And you get this really thick litter layer, which is very hard for any of the annual species in particular to penetrate. So you lose species like eyebright and linum. They just are unable to grow where there isn't bare soil. So you get overall a reduction of flowering plants. And critically, you get invasive non-native species. And as Gemma's going to talk more about this, I'm going to focus on invasive non-native species. So coming up on your screen will be a picture of non-native Catania. And this is a real problem on limestone calcareous grasslands, not just in Wales, but across the UK and across the water in Ireland. I've recently been in contact with somebody over there who's having similar problems. And really, that decline in grazing probably is what kickstarts the increase in this species. It's obviously invaded out from gardens. And then you have this drop in grazing, and then you see this enormous explosion in species like Catania. The problem is that once you've got to the stage where you've got really, really large numbers, large levels, high cover of Catania, grazing in itself is never going to solve your problem. And you're talking about really lengthy, costly management to get rid of it. And grazing, the most grazing will do is control bits of it. So really, the message with calcareous grasslands is you've got to act. And I've put here, if you can read that, take immediate action. Do not leave your calcareous grasslands to become Catania infested. As soon as the grazing starts dropping and you see Catania extending, you really need to take action and start managing it. Otherwise, it's going to cost you literally millions of pounds to control it. Then I wanted to talk about species poor unimproved grasslands and semi-improved. And in particular, here in Wales, we have vast areas of acid grassland in the upland fringes, but also in the lowlands. And it's really disregarded. It tends to look terrible. It's often very heavily sheep grazed, often compacted, so poor soil structure, and thought of as not a particularly interesting grassland. But over the years, I've come to realise that even these sorts of grassland can be quite special if they're managed properly, and that means usually changing your grazing regime, moving away from sheep-dominated systems and year-round grazing, getting pulse grazing, getting more heavy livestock cattle on. And although these grasslands may never particularly have rare species, you can get spectacular displays of very common flowers like tormentil, milkwort, heathbed straw, and campanula, so harebell. So these grasslands may not be the rarest thing we have, but they can be a really important pollinator resource if managed properly. And I think we really need to understand that acid grasslands are not as bad as we all think they are. They can be really, really, really important resource. The semi-improved grasslands and the very species poor grasslands, they're our sort of palette for improvement, enhancement. This is where we often do hay meadow creation or species rich pasture creation. So they're really valuable, and these are ones which we can lose really easily because they're often not even mapped, or people are not aware of them. So this is a semi-improved grassland on the Llŷn Peninsula. And one thing I would say about some of these grasslands is they may look really poor, but sometimes you find that actually if you disturb the seed bank, you get something like the next picture, which is a diversity of maritime flowers which appeared on this semi-improved pasture on the Llŷn. So this was going to become a hay meadow, and it was harrowed and seeded, but actually this wild carrot came in of its own accord. So what looked like a really poor field was actually had quite a good seed bank, and is now really quite a remarkable site. And also sometimes these semi-improved grasslands and these very poor grasslands, you harrow them and you actually come up with arable species. And there's some extraordinary places where I've seen this happen in North Wales, but also down in Pembrokeshire, where just a field's been left harrowed, and then you get this amazing display of arable weeds, which in themselves are a rare commodity in parts of Wales. So just to finish with, I was going to talk about coastal grasslands. Coastal grasslands are spectacular. The picture you should have on your screen now is of Pembrokeshire coast, and early spring flowers, a massive spring squill. But they also support some really lovely species-rich calcareous grasslands and neutral grasslands. And grazing is absolutely critical to these coastal sites. But coastal grasslands probably suffer abandonment and undermanagement more than any other grasslands. Why? Well, because the coastal belt is very difficult, it's narrow, there's often steep slopes and dangerous cliffs, and of course we have high public pressure because we have in Wales we have a All Wales Coastal Pass, so that creates a lot of issues, and that's particularly with dogs. In Wales we certainly have had examples of all types of livestock being chased over cliffs, including cattle, horses, sheep, and goats even have been lost over cliffs due to public pressure. So because of these issues, the land tends to become separated from the farm, and then it's very easy to abandon or undermanage. And with coastal grasslands, the change can be really swift. So on this slide, I hope you see now, on the right you'll see an area which had lots of spring squill, and this was only 5 or 6 years ago. And then because the farming system has changed and the coastal belt has been fenced off, it's actually now turning into quite a rank grassland, and already in 5 or 6 years you're seeing a decline in species. So the change can be really rapid. But there are solutions. So this is a site on the Llŷn Peninsula. It's part of the Tira Moor SMS project and the National Trust Payment for Outcomes scheme. You can see here it's very, very rank. It's a 3.5 hectare site. There was a history of livestock being lost over the cliff, with dogs chasing livestock over the cliff, so it had been abandoned. The maritime grassland was very overgrown with a thick litter layer, and you can see bracken, not here, but further up on the slope, there's bracken and bramble and gorse expansion. So as part of the project, we've been trying to work to sort this out. So first of all, is trying to get agreement with the farmer in principle to graze. And some farmers are obviously very nervous about grazing the coastal belt because of the public pressure. But in this case, we had a really amenable farmer who was happy to try it again. So first thing was to manage the bracken so we could actually increase the area of grassland to give him more feed. Then fence the top of the cliff, because the cliff is really very sheer. Make sure there's water on the site, because many coastal sites don't have water because they've been abandoned for so long. Introduce livestock and agree the timing, which I'll talk back a bit in a minute. And then really importantly is signage on the coastal path. It's so heavily used that you need to make sure that people really understand that there are going to be livestock on the path and what livestock are going to be there. So in this case, it was cattle being put out on the coastal belt. 4 Herefords went out. This is the second winter that they've been out, and from this picture you can see what they've done already. On the left hand side is where they've really started to clear the feg and the dense vegetation. I've just been back there last week, and it's even cleaner now than when this picture was taken, and the spring flowers are beginning to come through really well. So things to think about on the coastal belt: there needs to be escape routes. The livestock need to be able to get away if there are dogs or people. On the site on the Fleen is actually quite an easy access down the slope, and people don't tend to go down. But on this picture here, you can see, this is on the Gower, which is one of Emma's sites. You can see that the cattle have actually made a little escape route through the dense vegetation to get away from people, and it's really important. You need to minimise pinch points so people and animals don't come together, and this can be done by careful choice of gates, sites and styles for public access. And the signage needs to be really timed. So you need to tell them when livestock are actually there. If you just have a sign saying livestock and it's there all year and there's not livestock all year, people don't tend to take any notice. And you can use social media as well, which is what has happened on the Gower. So just lastly on timing. If you've got problems with your livestock and people and dogs, you might want to think about timing outside the critical public season, the tourism season, which is obviously the summer. And what we found is that this is really quite a good for the site, in fact, because if you remove the grazing in the summer, you can actually get that flowering period. So you can avoid the people, avoid the dog issue, but get that grazing. So a number of sites, this is another site on the Fleen, this has just been fenced as well, and this has been winter grazed, and the stock come off in the summer. And it's now allowed to flower. And I went there last week, and this was just full of early purple orchids. So it's a really successful way of grazing it. The only thing I would say is if you're looking at winter grazing on coastal sites, the one problem would be chuff. If you've got a chuff site and you take your livestock off in the summer, you're not going to have a dung resource for them. So you have to sort of think about what the issues are. If the issue is about public access, then you might think, well, actually, I have to not have livestock there in the summer. But if, on the other hand, it's a really important chuff site, you may think, well, I do need some sort of dung resource there. So looking at how you modify your grazing regime. But these sites on the Fleen, which are now coming back into management, have been really successful and shown that you can manage coastal grassland successfully. So I will stop there. Thank you for listening. And I will stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand over to Sinead next.
Great. I'll just share screens. Okay. Great. So thank you guys. Thanks to PONT and Plant Life for having me on to talk. So I'm Sinead, I'm the Conservation Manager for Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and I'm going to talk a bit at first about what bumblebees need, because it's really important to sort of understand the life cycle and habitat requirements in order to sort of understand sort of habitat management. So I'm kind of slightly unashamedly coming at it from a species perspective, but I'll try and whiz through this first bit, and then I'm going to talk a bit more broadly about habitat management and a bit about some of the work we've been doing on sort of herbal lays with some farmers. So just as a kind of the bee basics, because a lot of people kind of think there's just sort of one type of bee. Maybe most people don't think about bees quite as much as I do, so that's fair enough. But bumblebees are kind of the big furry, buzzy, stripy ones, essentially. That's not the kind of technical description. This one here is a shrill carder bee, so that's one of the kind of rare species we have in Wales. And I just wanted to sort of start off by almost start off at the end by trying to encapsulate what I'm going to talk about in sort of one picture. Move you guys over there. So kind of what does good bumblebee habitat sort of look like? And this is like a south-facing corner of a field. It's just down the road from where I live, and I just saw this field corner and I thought, this just looks perfect, and it's got everything that bumblebees need just in this little area. And you've got the trees there in the background, and there's some willow in there, so that's great for spring forage for not just bumblebees but lots of different pollinators. And then bramble, very much a really important plant for pollinators as well. And then you've got these wide field margins with lots of tall vegetation, tussocky grass, and then on the left hand side there you've got the kind of the field boundary there, which is slightly more shaded, but you get these kind of spring forage plants coming up, and also things like foxgloves, but dead nettles, red campion, that kind of thing. And then you've got that kind of hay meadow there, which is obviously really floristically rich, and that's cut sort of in July, and there's sheep grazing on this field. But I just kind of thought this really encapsulated lots of stuff that we try to talk to people about habitat management for bumblebees and other pollinators. And also to mention, I mentioned it's south facing, but it's also really sheltered as well. So that's really kind of encapsulates a lot of stuff I'm going to talk about. So going from that little microcosm out to the wider landscape, and particularly for bumblebees, very mixed heterogeneous landscapes are really important for bumblebees. So basically landscapes that have got lots of natural habitats, which, you know, for a lot of our landscapes is not what we currently have. We have some really intensively farmed landscapes that are monoculture, and there's very little in the way of natural habitats. So landscapes that are made up of, you know, particularly grassland, but also, you know, all of the kind of other habitats that are important for all our wildlife, so hedgerows, wetland, woodland, field margins, etc. So just to talk a little quickly about what bumblebees need, it's quite straightforward really. So they need food, obviously, so and they get all of their food from flowers, so they forage for pollen and nectar from flowers. They need that forage to be available all throughout the year, and they need a diversity of forage as well. So that's where all the different habitats come in, and they need shelter as well. So they need somewhere to nest particularly, and they need somewhere to hibernate. And what's really crucial is that those patches of habitat are connected, or, you know, kind of close together, so they're not having to travel long distances to find forage. And grasslands are obviously, you know, really some of our most floristically rich habitats. So they're completely vital for bumblebees and other pollinators. And if you look at when we saw the greatest decline in grassland habitats, you know, we've lost 97% of our lowland grasslands. It really mirrors the decline in bumblebees, particularly if you take away that much of a group of species, that you take away that much habitat, then they're obviously going to suffer. So just to kind of drill down a little bit on the forage as well, I've mentioned some of this, some of this stuff about forage, but diversity is really important in terms of being able to provide that sort of varied diet for for bumblebees, so it's not a kind of monoculture of the same thing, and also that caters to different species, so that's really important. And you can kind of do that with a diversity of habitats, but also grasslands are obviously some of our most not just floristically rich but diverse in terms of flowers, so that's why they're quite important. And it's worth bearing in mind that different different flowers will have different kind of nutrients and things that they're looking for, so things like amino acids, even caffeine as well. There's some research out looking at bumblebees kind of preferentially foraging on plants that contain caffeine, and that helps them deal with the pathogens in the nest. So there's all sorts of stuff we probably don't know the vast majority about, but they're obviously, they need that diversity, they need lots of different types of flowers to forage on. And broadly speaking, bumblebees are kind of generalists in terms of the habitats and flowers that they use, but the quality and the kind of connectedness of that habitat is quite crucial for some of our rarest species. So I'm just going to pick out some key key plants for bumblebees in grasslands. I kind of mentioned earlier about legumes. So legumes are obviously, grasslands are really great habitats for, great habitats for different legume species. So I've picked out a few here. So particularly red clover, tufted vetch, bird's foot trefoil, meadow vetchling. These are really great sources of forage for bumblebees. They probably get slightly less competition from other pollinator groups as well, because they're more kind of complex flower shapes. But also you've got kind of, I mentioned the astudiaethau earlier, so you've got things like common knapweed, fleabane, all of those different yellow composites that you get in grasslands, so sort of hawkbits, hawkweeds, cat's ear, that kind of thing, and thistles as well. That's not always something that you want to shout too much at farmers, but they're, you know, great for bumblebees. And then you've got other groups of plants like scabiouses. You've got things like yellow rattle and red bartsia, self-heal, betony. So lots of these very sort of common and widespread plants that you find in grasslands. These are really what are quite key for bumblebees. I was just going to mention as well a few kind of groups of plants or plants that bumblebees probably don't go for so much. So things like buttercups, stitchworts, and umbellifers not so much as well. So there are sort of some groups of plants that you probably don't see them foraging on quite as much. So, I mean, obviously you guys will know that a lot of our kind of countryside is you know, commercial and intensive farming. So what are the opportunities there for providing this forage if you can't restore grassland habitats? You know, it's obviously difficult, and you know, farmers are running a business, you know, so that's always difficult. So kind of reflecting back on those key grassland plants that I mentioned, you know, there are agricultural mixes which, you know, can be sort of superficially a bit like meadows, and you know, at least providing bees and other pollinators with forage. So, you know, legume rich agricultural mixes, for example. So we've been doing some work with farmers to kind of explore ways of kind of increasing forage for bumblebees through more productive farming techniques. So we've worked quite a bit with Callum Wen Organic Milk Cooperative on introducing more herbal lays to farms and ways that you can manage them to kind of optimize benefits for pollinators. So I've mentioned obviously the kind of importance of legumes as part of a kind of bumblebee diet, and happily legumes are also a vital tool for farming, and especially sustainable farming systems. So species like red clover, samfoin, lucerne, bird's foot trefoil are all kind of common agricultural species as well. And this is quite kind of old technology almost, you know, legumes have been used obviously for centuries in farming systems. And one of the farmers that we work with, one of the Callum Wen farmers, phrased it really brilliantly as well. And when he was talking about the kind of organic system that he uses, and he was saying, why would you buy this expensive nitrogen fertilizer when you can use plants which suck the nitrogen out of the air and put it in the soil for you? And I just thought that was a really good way of putting it. And, you know, a lot of the kind of recent research is sort of showing what many farmers have understood for generations, which is, you know, the benefits of these diverse swards. So the herbal ley we were using with Callum Wen had 17 species in, I think. So it had a range of grasses, so cocksfoot, rye grasses, timothy, fescues, also a range of legumes, so it included samfoin, red clover, sweet clover, white clover, so I'm just reading them out, lucerne, Alside clover, bird's-foot trefoil. These are obviously all agricultural variants. Burnet forage, herb, chicory, ribgrass, sheep's parsley, and yarrow. So quite a range of species in there. And there's obviously lots of different mixes, and that's a herbal ley mix, but there are other multi-species swards that are also legume rich and that include things like chicory or yarrow as well. So we were working with Callum Wen and also Farm and Connect, Mentor Business. And they put together this kind of little infographic just to kind of explain some of the benefits to farmers. So we know that the kind of from research, particularly across Europe, we know that some of these multi-species mixes, which include legumes and chicory and various different grasses, can be used without any nitrogen fertilizer input. And they've been found to be, in certain circumstances, not across the board, but in certain circumstances, as productive or more productive than just ryegrass leys with nitrogen fertilizer. So that's a real win in terms of sustainable farming. So it's, you know, potentially a really good option for farmers to start using these leys rather than ryegrass. We know from extensive European-wide research that multi-species mixes are kind of better for livestock in terms of providing more variety in their diet. And for example, bird's-foot trefoil and chicory contain higher levels of tannins. So that can help to reduce parasitic worms in a more sort of natural way. Herbal leys contain some deep-rooting species such as sorrel, yarrow and chicory, which can help to deal with, particularly in you know, drought sort of circumstances. They can help to provide some drought tolerance and also help to move nutrients and minerals through the soil, making them more available to grazing livestock, which could help to reduce the need to bring in concentrates. We know that the high protein rich sort of legume content of the leys, as I said, reduces the need for any artificial fertilizer. Also, growing a mixture of species ensures a longer growing season, so it increases productivity and has this kind of over yielding effect as well. I'm going to go on next to talk a little bit about the kind of using herbal leys as a potential stepping stone between improved pasture through to semi-improved. So that's something that I know has been explored by some farmers. And obviously that those deep rooting plants can help to improve or help with compaction, for example. So some of the farmers we worked with in terms of the Callum Wen farmers have started using these herbal leys, and they're all, and other farmers as well, not just Callum Wen, and they're all carrying on using them, even though the seed is quite a lot more expensive. Oh, so I was just going to mention the challenges as well. Obviously, it's not all a completely sort of benefits, because there's obviously another side to it. So obviously the seed is much more expensive. So that's one thing to bear in mind. For some farmers, it may not fit in so well with the farming system. So these mixes they work for a range of pastoral farming systems, but they probably work better for kind of a extensive grazing. So it may not work for some farmers. And I know the chicory, if you're using herbalaise for silage, I know the chicory can be a little bit problematic in terms of breaking the silage wrap. But I should say I'm not an expert on herbalaise, so if anyone wants to go down this route, I would definitely recommend talking to the relevant seed company. So this is just, I was just going to highlight this example, which is me and Emma me and Emma from PONT went to a day at a farm near Drwy, which this is Rob Havard, and he was talking about in some of his fields he'd used herbal ley seed to kind of, as a bit of a stepping stone between the kind of slightly more intensive grazing and I think arable, to move it towards sort of species-rich grassland. So it kind of helped to reduce weed burden and also helped to sort of reduce compaction, and basically was a bit of a kind of stepping stone. And he's using a kind of holistic planned grazing approach. So he's very much moving his herd around, and he's using that kind of graze a third, trample a third, leave a third sort of approach. So that helps the plants kind of grow back quicker. Right, I'll just move on. So this is just to talk about the project we were doing with Calon Wen, which we're carrying on actually this year. So this is Anna, my colleague, and basically the Calon Wen farmers have been using herbal leys and also red clover leys, and they've been leaving these uncut margins in these ley fields, and we've been monitoring the margins to see if they're beneficial for pollinators and whether herbal leys are better than red clover leys. I should say it didn't work for all of the farmers. There were some various sort of challenges there. And this graph basically just demonstrates the difference. So the larger circles there, the larger pie charts there, are basically the bigger the pie chart, the more individual pollinators we recorded. And obviously it's broken down into the different species or taxa. So the big pie charts there are the uncut margins, the small little pie charts are the cut margins. So it really just demonstrates the difference of leaving just a little bit of uncut margin on actually any legume-rich ley. And I was just going to mention as well about sort of, so a lot of the farmers that we've worked with, the Calon Wen farmers, have used other habitats around the farm to kind of fill in gaps in forage. So using track sides, margins, fill corners, and basically just helping to fill in the gaps in forage. I was just going to mention as well about nesting habitat. So, so this is a really crucial aspect of managing a farm with pollinators in mind, obviously particularly bumblebees. So we've been working with farmers to make sure there's tusky grass available for nesting. So that can be hedgerow margins, scrub, woodland edge, and you know, any kind of sunny sort of sheltered spot where you can encourage some tusky grass. And ideally you would leave that tusky grass to grow for up to 4 years and cut it on rotation. So, and cut and remove. It's really important to remove that, all of that grass. And if you can have that on a rotation and you've got mature tussocky grass on some part of the farm or part of the site, then that's that's ensuring you've got somewhere for bumblebees to nest over that 4-year period. So we've just got a couple of case studies, and this is Stuart. This is the farmer who was talking about the use of legumes fixing nitrogen in the soil, and he's been using herbal lays, and he's one of the farmers that's been leaving uncut strips there. He's also been kind of just experimenting with scratching. He calls it scratching. I don't know if that's a technical term, but just scratching herbal lay seed into some of his older lays. So just to kind of introduce that seed in. So that's him, and he's also been leaving uncut margins in his hay meadow as well. And at Cop House, again, David's been leaving uncut margins in herbal lays and red clover lays. So you can see them here in the pictures, and this is all the chicory in flower, so all those blue flowers, and great for lots of pollinators. The chicory was really great for honeybees as well. And also that he has this sort of organic rotation, so he'll grow a kind of combi crop, so a pea and grain combi crop, and so that's those kind of areas are great for arable weeds as well. He had quite sandy soil, so he's got great kind of wildflower banks, which he created from the spoil from ditch work. And then there's Byddwn and Fawr, where they also have been, again, using herbal lays and red clover lays. The uncut margins didn't work so well at Byddwn because they've got very sort of frisky cattle. So that was definitely a challenge, and we've kind of had to think about alternative options rather than just leaving margins. But they are using herbal lays really extensively, and they've also got a lot of permanent pasture, so we were able to talk to them about the management of their kind of semi-improved grassland as well, and how to kind of ensure that those areas are left ungrazed in the summer. And this is Trysinwen Farm down in Pembrokeshire. Richard's been leaving uncut margins on red clover lays, and very much the same as with Byddwn, where Richard's got some nice semi-improved grassland, which we've just electric fenced off, and or he's done that, and he's just going to reduce summer grazing on some of those fields. And all of the farmers have had signs to put up in their different fields, so they can obviously show the public and probably basically all their neighbouring farmers what they're doing, to explain why they're leaving margins uncut, why they've got kind of scruffy corners in their fields, why they're leaving dandelions, all that kind of stuff. So I think this has been a really great thing to do. The farmers really have just putting up their signs at the moment, so it's really great to be also telling people about what we're doing. So I think that's me. Yeah, so just to say, the Pasture for Pollinators project, which we've been doing with Callum Wen and Mentor Business, has just come to an end, and we're starting a new project called Callum Gwenin. So watch this space.
Thanks, Sinead. I'm now going to pass over to Sorcha, who farms herself in the Elan Valley, and she's going to tell us a little bit about her farm and how she manages that farm.
Okay, share screen. Play. Okay, hi, yes, my name is Sorcha Lewis, and I'm farming in the Elan Valley on a family farm. And let me go back to the beginning. And we farm 580 hectares, and it has a range of different ground, obviously uplands with free hay meadows and rossy ground. This image just gives you a bit of a feel for the landscape in which we farm. And it's known
quite famously, I suppose, in mid Wales, because it's a water catchment where the water goes to Birmingham. And due to that, a lot of visitors come, 400,000 of them, come to see the dams and enjoy the landscape in which they're set. So this is a landscape in which the elements and topography often control how we farm, and we tend to need to work with nature to achieve the best for the farm. When we try and cheat, we often suffer the repercussions of it, probably amplified because of the harshness and of the upland landscape environment. So you can just see the house on the slide, that's just under the rainbow, and just a bit closer to the bottom is our barns. They're more modern agricultural barns, but they've replaced something that was called the caich, which is a barn that sort of suggests the landscape's connection to milk, which I'm assuming is connected to cattle once being within the landscape. The old barn dated back to the 1700s, where there's an old story of a robber holding up in the barn overnight whilst he was being chased by the authorities, probably sheep rustling or something, I don't know. So it's sort of just giving you a little bit of a story of the long history, just by understanding the farm that as it went before us, really, even though we're sort of third generation on this hill farm. The barn itself is on top of, there are fields running down to the right hand side of it, and most of these are hay meadows. The farm itself was originally 3 farms. They've all been put together, obviously, when the land was compulsory purchased to make the reservoirs for storage of water. That broke up a lot of the small farms. And at the top of many of these little fields, there would have been a barn, because that's where they would have collected the hay in, which of course was important to upland farming systems, because you needed fodder to feed the livestock over a harsh winter. So my next slide really is exactly the same view, but I think it just sort of, because it's a bit of an autumn picture, it just gives you a little bit more of a feel of the habitats that you can see in it. So there's the uplands there at the top, and then that comes down to the bracken slopes. There's an area of freeth running behind the house and along the edges of the hills. The orange, the bright orangey colour to the bottom of the screen is mostly Millennia, or purple moorgrass, or rush pasture, and we also call it the Ross, is one of the names for it. I'm going to be talking about the in-by Millennia, because the open hill does require some scaling up and could be probably a webinar all on its own. Most of the in-by land is that is Ross, is sort of on the outskirts of the hay meadows. And you can just see coming in on the right of the slide some conifers there. So I often think about this, because one of the things, the decisions they made when they compulsory purchased the land was, do they really need farmers on it? They sort of thought, well, it's water, let's get everybody off. And then it was pointed out in Parliament that actually, who's going to manage this landscape that you've got, you know, you better keep some of them. So a lot of the farmers continued with their tenancies. And the forestry, I often think, would be what we would see in this picture if there wasn't a community on the landscape. And the Coronation Meadow for Radnorshire, and in fact is actually in the Ellen Valley, it's in the Clairwyn Valley. And in the 1940s, it was under threat of being planted by conifer, but it was of such value to the farmer that they fought very hard to keep the hay meadows, because they valued having the fodder, and the fact that there was species-rich hay meadows, it was even more valued. So today the Coronation Meadow is still probably just there because of the fact that there are people in the land and it's not forestry. So back into sort of the millennia. So as you can see from the left-hand slide, this is the millennia at the base of our hay meadows. And in that millennia, you will get Devil's Bit scabious and woodbitter vetch in that little patch. And then when the hay meadows are cut, it does allow a little bit of an area for pollinating insects. And so there's a little, it's not a big removal of everything for them. And then the picture on the right hand side just shows cutting the hay. And I'm going to talk a bit about the patch behind the tractor where you can see the house. So below the road is a hay meadow, special scientific interest, and above the road is some millennia grassland. So right, so I quite like millennia actually. I mean, don't often say that because sometimes I just feel like when I'm walking through it, oh my God, you know, when it's yellow and dense and everything, but it is troublesome, and it's increasingly difficult to manage when it's tussocky. But these are some of the photos taken from around the farm when the millennia, the purple moorgrass, has been managed by the grazing, and as you can see, it actually provides quite a lot of special areas for wildlife. So for example, there's the fragrant orchids, devil's bit scabious, we've got common spotted orchids, and in the wetter flushes, the sundews, the lousewort, and even the water voles. So a lot of the uplands, the Ellen Valley is a national key area for water voles, and they tend to quite like the sort of millennia edges which they have their burrows in, and they tend to feed a lot on juncus, and we have all these sort of on the farm and in the valley. So this is again another couple of my favorites on the farm. So we've got the globe flower and sawwort, which we get again in the sort of damper areas around the sides of the hay meadows. And I think it's the only patch of globe flower in the valley now, which makes me feel a little bit responsible for it. But the pictures below show looking down from our land across the reservoir, and the bottom left picture shows a hedgerow. Behind the hedgerow is another SSSI hay meadow because of its variety in plants. And just to the underneath where you can see the sort of yellowy millennia, that again is part of the SSSI, and we are instructed to have to graze that all year round. I think under the worry that the millennia will actually increase, and that will sort of swamp out some of the plants. Although again, with a lot of management, there's gains and losses, and doing it that way, I know that we have lost a patch of meadow thistle because it's open there for grazing all year round. So moving on, again down to another patch of quite thick millennia at the edge of one of our hay meadows is always been a bit of a dilemma because it's managed as part of the hay meadow, and that's done quite well. So a hay meadow, we shut off the stock at the beginning of May, and the hay meadow does its growing, and on the whole that's great. But for the millennia on the edges, that's difficult because it's been allowed to get a bit thicker and ranker. And this one spot, we have tried to have some discussions about what we can do, because we did have fragrant orchids and that's being lost down there. We do have devil's bit scabious and marsh violets, so it's a really good place for fritillaries. And a couple of years ago we did find a small white orchid there, and I know you can't manage a habitat for one species, but he does feel rather important, and he's a little bit of a spindly specimen, but I won't hear anything bad about him. This was what he looked like this last year. Only 3 little flowers, but they must have smelled rather fine because it was covered in little tiny flies that I assume were pollinating it. 2 years prior to having this rather special small white orchid, there was the other one, and I went down and looked at it because, you know, it was something quite interesting. And when I went down one day, I discovered that a slug had demolished it. So this year I decided we come up with a plan of having a little piece of copper pipe, which we put down over the top of the small white orchid, and no slug dare touch him this year. So I don't know, that's the best I could do on a little sort of gardening scale. But again, it's a lovely little piece of grassland, which is always a little bit of a thorn on my side because it is difficult to try and manage the fact that it is trying to revert back to scrub as well. a great place for the small mammals. And on the edge, the very bottom right-hand photograph, right on the edge is a great place for bog asphodel and orchids and lousewort and milkwort, and it's just teeming with life. So now we can see the hay meadow to the right below the road in that top right picture where the sky is lovely and blue, and to the left is the Rossi patch. And for a number of, maybe 20 years, it's been managed, the Rossi bit, as the hay meadow below. And we've decided that we're going to fence it off now because it is becoming ranker, and we seem to be losing on the sort of more grassy area. It used to be carpets of bird's foot trefoil and tormentil, and we do have this tormentil mining bee that was found in the valley. So just trying to keep the flowers going and having some available grass for the cattle. So my husband is on there. He's not playing at Excalibur, although he does look like it. He's very busy digging the fence posts to go into the ground there, and it's just going to have a layer of barb just to try and bring that rankness back a little bit. And then there's a field above that called Cae Cloi, which is calves field. So it obviously has got some association with cattle. So this time of year, it's been quite a cold spring and then a wet spring. And you can see on the right, there's not even any grass growing on the hay meadow. So we've got all the stock off it. It's all shut off. But now the millennia is just starting to come and there's nothing to eat it. So this is sort of how it's becoming ranker over the years. So these are our cattle. So we've got Shorthorn across Hereford with a little bit of Galloway in. And there's a wise old farm gentleman who sort of terms them as the upland management tools. And he's very passionate about it. And he's definitely right. They play a big part in the farm and a big part in the wildlife diversity, without a doubt. So this one is another picture of the same fencing above the track. So the cattle were put in last week because now only the millennia is growing. So hopefully it will knock it back, and in a couple of weeks when that grass has been hit, then we will take the cattle back off it, and the devil's bit scabious and things can hopefully get their little bit of a hold as well. So looking across from our farm here, we're on the top of the hill where it is more millennia dominated, looking across to the reservoir to Hernant, which is our neighbour's farm. And I just wanted to sort of slide this in because it's a special area of conservation for its birds. So obviously we looked a bit at plants as well, but he's very important for the curlew. And this has been a more mechanical sort of management of it, because he does have a lot of cattle that he is using to graze it, but the tussocks have all got so big, they're like little cousin its, and they've needed sort of knocked down a bit. So they've had to use bigger sort of mowers just to take that density off and allow the cattle to get in a little bit more and graze it down. And I think there's about 5 pairs of breeding curlew up there at the minute. There's short-eared owl, lizard, stone chat, wind chat, merlins, kestrels, all use this area. So, and having that mix of structure where you have higher bits of millennia and shorter grassland is exactly what the curlews are after. So we do most of our management. People tend to not like these, but they are quite important. So these are the Welsh mountain sheep. These are probably quite an old breed. They're quite small, they're hardy, and they are needed in their part in the meadows and in the Ross purple moorgrass management. So the cattle often come on to the meadows at the end of when they're cut, and they do a bit of grazing around and the millennia, and then after that, once the sheep get on it, they keep down, especially in the springtime, they graze down the ground so that they remove most of the really competitive grasses, which allow some of the flowers to make their way through. So it is a careful balance. So we also have these badger-faced Welsh mountain, which probably have been on the hills of the Ellen Valley since the time of the Cistercian monks. They would have bred out their markings because they'd have had the white sheep that you've seen in the previous picture, because they would be easier to dye for wool and stuff like that. But every now and then, like you get a black sheep turn up in a hill, you can get a badger-faced torvie turn up in the hill as well. I think it's just to illustrate that the landscape has been farming and working with the landscape, you know, since the time of the Cistercian monks. So when managed right, Molinia grassland can be rich in wildlife. And I think that it's one thing that farmers should be better rewarded for managing habitats, and particularly Molinia grasslands that can look quite amazing and be so beneficial if they're done right. And I think most Molinia grasslands, people will probably agree, are usually undergrazed, which means that it does become rank and not so good for wildlife. Probably a bit of an impact from the fact that, you know, were area-based payments, so you still received a payment on a ground regardless of what its condition was. So policies that reward farmers for habitat management and facilitate the cattle grazing and advice for farmers is particularly important going forward, I think. And I know the NFFN are looking and talking with Welsh Government about this. So I suppose, you know, if you support, you know, the nature-friendly farming movement, you know, join up and give us some support. And thank you for taking time to listen.
Thanks very much, Sorcha. That was great to hear about Molinia, and lovely to hear someone saying how they like Molinia. I think you probably need to turn your screen off.
I can't find me. Oh yeah. Hey.
Our final speaker is Gemma, who works for the National Trust, and she's going to talk about the Great Orme.
Hi, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay, is that working? Oh, everyone's frozen. Yeah, oh, great, thank you.
Yeah, Gemma. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction, Jan. Yeah, I'm going to talk about conservation grazing on the Great Orme, Pennagogath. This is a lovely Carboniferous limestone headland which sticks up off the North Wales coast, just near Llandudno. It's a fascinating place. It's got a really interesting mix of habitats and species. It's got a really interesting history, and it's a very popular visitor site, about 600,000 visitors a year. So it's an interesting but complex site to manage. And the management here is, there's a whole partnership of organisations. So I work for the National Trust, but there's many other organisations involved in the management, and also Dan Jones, who's the farmer here. So he's working with all these different partner organisations to try and make sure that the grazing is working for habitats and species and for people as well. So this is an aerial shot of the Great Orme. You can see Llandudno up on the right hand side there. And Park Farm, the area in red in the middle, is the bit that the National Trust owns. This isn't anywhere near as interesting in terms of habitats and things as the rest of the Orme, but it's got a really crucial role to play because it has all of the grazing rights. So it's a really important tool in managing the whole site. The history of the Orme is really interesting. There's been a history of human occupation for at least 10,000 years. There are copper mines which date back to the Bronze Age, and there's evidence of farming going back to, I think, the medieval period. So you can see in the pictures on the right hand side there, there's ridge and furrow that's still visible today, so evidence of arable cultivation. And there's also evidence of livestock farming going back many, many years. And it's this combination of this land use by humans and also the underlying geology and the climate and exposure at this site, which has kind of formed these kind of fascinating mosaics of habitats and these little niches for all the different rare species that live here. The site, apart from Park Farm in the middle, the rest of the site is designated as SAC and SSI. It's got some really internationally important habitats, including the limestone grassland, limestone heath and maritime cliffs. The grassland and heath form a really kind of complex mosaic where the soil has leached, the lime has leached out of the soil in areas, it becomes slightly more acidic and the heath then can form, and you get these really lovely little patches of species-rich heath with heather and dwarf shrubs, but also lime-loving species like rock rose and dropwort that kind of intermingles amongst it. So it's really fascinating place. And the species that this supports, it has a huge number of plant species, including various endemic species. So this one on the right with the berries is the only native cotoneaster in the UK, and it's endemic to the Orme. I think there's just 6 bushes of this known in the wild, and they're all found on the Great Orme. So a really interesting rare one. And then there's all sorts of grassland invertebrates, which are dependent on these lovely limestone grasslands. There's a really long list of rare lichens, and the sea cliffs support all sorts of breeding seabirds like razorbill and chough, which then come inland and forage on the agricultural land. So as you can see, really interesting place, really important place for biodiversity. Unfortunately, over the last few decades, the SAC monitoring has indicated that these habitats aren't in favourable condition, and the main reason behind that really is down to grazing or a lack of grazing in recent years. So there's anecdotal evidence that the grazing has decreased, so it's primarily sheep grazing there. At the moment, historically, there may have been cattle as well, but certainly in the last century, it's been sheep grazed, and that's been reducing since the First World War, really. And so, as Jan mentioned earlier, grazing is really critical for maintaining limestone grasslands. This is a really open habitat. A lot of the species need light, and they need little patches of bare earth so that the seeds can germinate and they can reproduce. So when the grazing is reduced and there's more thatch and more coarse grasses coming through, that's a real threat to this habitat type. And there are also invasive species here, as Jan mentioned earlier. Non-native cotoneaster is causing all sorts of interesting issues on the Orme, but I'm going to just focus on the grazing for now. So as I mentioned, Park Farm has all of the grazing rights. That's for 416 ewes and followers across 720 acres. And so back in 2016, when Park Farm became available, the National Trust acquired this with the sole aim of trying to turn around the condition of the habitats and really try and improve the grazing here. So you may have seen some publicity around it at the time. It was quite well publicised. The tenancy was advertised for £1 a year to really try and attract the right kind of grazier who was really interested in conservation as well. And there were applicants from all over the world interested. It was a really interesting process. But we were lucky enough to get Dan Jones as the farmer here, and he's been farming and living on the Orme ever since. And at the time, Plant Life bought 2 herds of sheep. I think it was 300 fleeing sheep and 70 herdwicks. And Dan has been grazing them across the Orme since then. And he's using a sort of active shepherding approach, really moving the sheep around to specific areas to target the grazing where it's needed the most. So here's a little example. The sheep are grazing in an area of quite gorse-dominated heath, which has been cut by the country park team to try and allow access. The vegetation was a bit too tall, and course for the sheep to get into. So now they're able to get in there and graze it right down. And this is just an example of the shepherding plan, which the Dan and the different partner organisations come up with to try and really focus grazing in the right places. So you can see here the limestone grassland, because it needs to be very open, because it needs to have all those nice delicate species, needs to have lots of space and sunlight. That takes all year round light grazing, and then a big pulse of grazing early in the spring, just to make sure that those coarse grasses are knocked back. Other parts of the site just need grazing during the spring and summer, and then where there's heather growing, they're given a rest during the autumn and winter when the heather's a bit more vulnerable to grazing pressure. So this sort of plan just helps Dan to know where to move his sheep at the right time of year, and where to focus that grazing pressure. And feeding into that shepherding plan is the habitat monitoring, which is a really crucial part of this whole process. And Jan has actually been doing the monitoring on the Orme since 2016. So that started with a baseline survey, which involves, you can see the map there with little red dots on it. So there are plots located, fixed points, which get revisited time after time. And at each of those points, quadrats are used to assess things like the species present, the height of the sward, and the amount of thatch and litter that's developed, and the amount of flowering as well. And so the first round was done in 2016, and that was repeated in 2018, and is due to be repeated again this year. So I think at the outset, it was understood that this changes to the vegetation here is going to be slow. So we're not expecting drastic changes overnight. But after 2 years, there were some signs in some areas that the sward was looking shorter, with a bit less litter, which is really positive. Overall, though, across the whole site, no significant changes. Again, there were signs that the grazing was occurring in certain plots, and that's again positive. That means that the shepherding is working and targeting the right areas, but other plots were really inaccessible to the sheep, just too rank and too tall, particularly some of the heathy areas. So as the previous slide showed, those sites are going to require some cutting, some intervention before the sheep are able to get in there and make a difference. And the final point is just that continued monitoring is really crucial here. We're not likely to see any changes after just one round of monitoring. So it's an ongoing process. And so future plans here really crucially are to continue to implement the shepherding plan. That's really important. And these really rare and important habitats rely on that. And again, cutting through areas of grassland and heath to try and complement the shepherding as well. The invasive species management is ongoing. The country park team do a really great job, but it's just an ongoing project every year. They're tackling that. I'm going to show a little video clip in a moment from Dan. He's very kindly sent through a video showing some of the challenges that he faces grazing the Orme. And you'll see in that clip that fencing and infrastructure is a bit of an issue on this site, as is pressure from visitors, and particularly visitors with dogs. That can really cause problems for him in managing his livestock. And finally, I mentioned earlier that Park Farm itself isn't particularly diverse or interesting from a habitat point of view, but there are plans afoot. Dan's really keen to do some meadow creation within the enclosed farm and let some scrubby corners develop for birds and that kind of thing. So hopefully that will enhance the value for biodiversity of the Great Orme even further. So I'm going to hand over to Dan on the video, if I can get it working, fingers crossed. If you want to hear more from Dan, he's on Twitter and Facebook, so I'm sure he'd be really open to questions via those routes if you're interested to hear more from his perspective. And what I'll do is paste some of these links to websites in the chat in a minute. There's some fantastic videos on the Plant Life website showing a bit more information about the rare plants and about the shepherding, which you might be interested to have a look at. So I'm just going to attempt to show this video, and bear with me. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yeah, looks good.
It's pretty enough this afternoon. Looking for a lame sheep this morning somewhere. The Great Orme experiences weather extremes. Rain, wind, snowy, wintry weather combined with the terrain makes it quite treacherous at times. Wednesday the 30th of January 2019. One of the most difficult things to deal with is how quickly the weather can change. The visibility is a major issue with practical work. Visibility poor again today. We're going to try and feed some sheep and check that they're alright. Sheep have come and see me instead of me going to see the sheep recently, so see the Irish sea that way. All the ladies come and see me. Hey girls, hey girls! Hey girls. The Orme is a very challenging environment. The terrain is difficult to work on with lots of areas inaccessible to vehicles. There are dangerous areas which is only accessible when the weather is favourable. I have had to employ climbers to save sheep and dogs off cliffs, and I have also saved sheep and dogs from the sea. Over 600,000 people visit the Orme every year, making my farm the most visited farm in the country. Part of my role is to engage with the public, which I really enjoy. I've opened up the farm to the public by working with the National Trust and the Great Orme Country Park, creating a walking path through the farm. I have also regular groups from different schools, clubs and societies to see what, how and why we are farming on the Great Orme. This brings different challenges. With so many people visiting the Orme, it pushes sheep all over the place. There is no physical boundary between the Orme and the town of Llandudno. Therefore, hefting my sheep takes a big part of my day and have to regularly retrieve the sheep from town. Come on girls, come on! Come on girls, come on! It's also a fantastic place to enjoy the outdoors, especially if you're a dog owner. This has resulted, however, in lots of heartbreak. We've had over 20 dog attacks on the sheep that we know of.
Okay, hope that worked okay for everyone.
It was a bit jerky, but I think we tried 100 times and then it doesn't work. It's alright. I just put the message in the chat that we will put the full resolution video. We'll paste it into the recording when it goes on YouTube, so it will be full quality.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Gemma. And yeah, I hope everyone can see Dan's video better when it's on YouTube, because it is a really interesting video. I've seen it before. I've seen the whole thing from Dan, and it is really good, really interesting, and shows how hard it is to farm on the Orme.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for all the talks. I mean, it's really hard to even know where to start. There was such an amazing selection, in depth, so many interesting facts and information from all the details on the coastal grassland, and I think the importance of semi-improved or improved grassland as well for all the wildlife. That was really interesting, Jan, that you kind of pointed out, and the beautiful history and story of the white orchid and herbalace, and again the grey dorm history. Just, yeah, super interesting. Thank you so much for all the talks. We did have some questions come in, so we can now start the question and answer session. I will just change this into the gallery view, so now all the panelists can have the videos on. And I would like to start with the question that came in first from Amanda. Is there any financial support available to a small holding, 16 acres, from any organization to regenerate the biodiversity of upland overgrazed pasture?
Well, I suppose I'll start. I think it's quite difficult to get funding often for small holdings which aren't eligible for Glasswelltir. I think that has been a real problem. And the only way to do it is to find out if there are any projects in your area. So, for example, PONT has a project in Mid Wales where we're working with smallholders, and we provide funding for fencing and advice on getting livestock and things like that. So it'd be looking at to see what there is. It might be talking to ourselves, but probably also talking to Nature Friendly Farming Network will have links as well. But I think the smallholders have never been quite so well served as in terms of support. That may change though with new agri support, because I think there is more talk about, because they want to pay for sort of outcomes, that they may be looking at how they can support smaller farmers, smaller holders as well. So it may be a matter of talking to various organisations, seeing what's going on in your area and seeing if there are any projects which have funding which could link into what you want to do. Don't know if anyone else wants to say anything on that.
If not, would it be kind of, if Jan, maybe you can just expand, would it be the same on advice?
Yeah, I mean, you can talk to, in terms of advice, I mean, you know, PONT can give telephone advice. We unfortunately, we used to have funding from Welsh Government, which allowed us to go out and visit farms and give advice, and we don't have that anymore. But there are other organisations like the Wildlife Trusts and, you know, many of the NGO organisations will help you. And I think, you know, getting in touch with people like the Nature Friendly Farming Network is really important, and finding like-minded people who you can talk to. And events, you know, we run training events at PONT. Keep an eye on our website, and there are all sorts of events like that which people can get involved in.
Thanks, Jan. I would just like to add that Plant Life, we are actually and our project developing a new portal called Meadows Hub, which is going to be live in July, and we'll be also bringing lots of resources together, anything to do with grassland and meadow. So there will be also kind of farming elements to it. So if you're specifically interested in conservation grazing, there will be also some links to that, and there will be a couple of kind of interactive tools as well that you can use in terms of getting advice on creating meadows on various different scales. Next question that we got for Sinead, I think you mentioned something in your talk. You said jumpy cattle. What did you exactly mean by that? Is it how did the anchored margins cause problems for the cattle exactly?
Oh, so I think that was to do with they were grazing herbalace. That was Byddwn, I think, and because they weren't cut in for silage, they had to electric fence off their margins, and the cattle, I think they've got I think they're Ayrshire cattle, and they just basically would jump over the electric fence, so or just walk through it. So that didn't work so well.
A question for Sorcha. What is the best time of year for cattle grazing on non-linear grassland? And then it expands for both mown and unmown fields.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think we tend to find that because everything is slower anyway in the uplands, that we're looking maybe to graze them a linear around about May and June. so that the cattle are coming out of the sheds, and the millennia is usually a bit taller, so it's a good time, it's a benefit to us from farming to have a bit of millennia to put some cattle on before they go to the hill. I think an important thing about that is making sure that when they go out, we never we don't do any worming or anything, to make sure that you know, that's good for the little bugs and beasties that are also very important for our either our meadows or our grasslands, really. And another time of year probably would be September. The millennia is sort of dying back a little bit. We have a little bit of an issue because, like I said before, everything is round the hay meadow. So you're not supposed under glass tier to be able to graze within a month of cutting the hay, but of course the cattle wouldn't be really eating on the hay field. It's the stuff around it we want. So there's a little bit of a blip in sort of the management advice for that. But of course in September it's a good time because it can just knock it back a bit. It can trample a little bit, which is good as well for seeds. So we would like to get them on it September. It depends when we get the hay cut, because we're in the uplands. It's very wet because the dams are there. They built them for a reason. It also means that we don't tend to get our hay cuts August, maybe last year, even into September, and that again, you know, would impact it. So yeah, May and June and September. And I would say, well, obviously there's nothing on a meadow once you've cut it anyway, so you wouldn't particularly want anything on it for a month anyway, or two, if it was just strictly a field that was a meadow sort of thing. So yeah, does that answer?
Anyone else would like to add? Jan, is it kind of similar from your experience, timing?
Yeah, I think so, and because of course millennia can, the actual nutritional value of millennia really starts to decrease in later in the year, although cattle can take millennia as bulk feed even in the winter, but it's most nutritionally at its highest, you know, as Sorcha says, in May and June. That's when it's a more benefit.
There was a question about maybe Gemma and Jan, you can answer from your experiences. What is the best way you found to actually control the dam ketoniaste?
Okay, well, interestingly, PONT last year had a piece of work from NRW to write a handbook on ketoniaste control, which yes, we could make available for well, it actually belongs to NRW, I suppose, but I'm sure they will share it. And that was really interesting because it really depends on the form of your ketoniaste, your habitat, and what you've got there. So we kind of got advice from all across the UK and again in Ireland as well, and looked at different methods, and as I say, it's different in different situations. There are some sites in North Wales where literally there is 100% cover of ketoniaste now on what was really important. This is in triple SIs, really important grasslands. In fact, there was one bush which was so huge I called it the Yeti because it was enormous. I mean, it looked like a monster. And those sort of things, you've got to start. You've got to use contractors. You've got to probably stem inject and look at it, and that's really costly. But there's sort of smaller plants. You can be looking at painting, using brushes. Using on the Orme, that has been done in places where you've got small bushes, using paint brushes to put on a herbicide. We found that people who tried digging it out, that didn't work very well because it then produces loads of seedlings and they actually got everywhere. But if you've got very small plants, you can pull them out. So if you want to look at the handbook, I can try and find out where to get hold of that from NRW. But it is very different for every situation. And as I said at the start, the really important thing is to tackle it as soon as it appears on the site. Because once it gets away, and particularly if you haven't got enough grazing on that site, it's a really, really big management issue.
Gemma, have you got anything to add from your experience?
No, I think exactly what as Jan said, really. I think certainly on National Trust sites it's cut and then stem injected most often, but like Jan says, it's really dependent on location and conditions on site.
So would any animals actually graze it?
They do. I mean, you know, they will do. Animals will graze it if they're forced to graze it. You know, if there's nothing else to eat. But even it's really interesting because, of course, on the Orme you've got the wild, the semi-feral goat population. And while I was up there surveying the Cataniasta 2 years ago, and what was interesting, you could see the goats were ignoring it. And goats normally eat anything, but they really weren't selecting it as their first choice. So I think it's not something that livestock particularly want to eat. They'll only eat it if they're really forced to, or if they're really tiny seedlings, which they munch as they go along. But I think generally they really don't like it.
Thank you for that. Sinead, I've heard people say the cutting of hay is disastrous for invertebrates. Is that true? And if so, is it better to cut in sections?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I suppose I suppose partially true. I suppose it comes down to the kind of management objectives of the site and the species interests as well, because often those things can be conflicting. So, for example, if you've got a grassland which is still relatively nutrient rich and you want to reduce those nutrients, then you probably need to be cutting your hay and taking it off earlier in the summer, and particularly that can help to deal with kind of grasses as well, because if you leave it and cut it later, then the grasses will become more and more dominant. So there's that. So you've got to balance out that with other interests on site. So you might have species where you don't want to be grazing or cutting in the summer. You want to have kind of minimal disturbance, so you've got to kind of think about that. I suppose it comes down to knowing what you have on site. In terms of whether cutting in and of itself is disastrous for invertebrates, I mean, obviously when you're cutting for hay, there'll be lots of invertebrates in there and other things, obviously amphibians and all sorts of other stuff in there, so that in and of itself is going to be disturbing lots of wildlife. But if you're leaving lots of sheltered areas and you're leaving uncut margins, you're leaving plenty of uncut areas, then that's helping to kind of mitigate the kind of the short-term loss of habitat. So I think in terms of cutting times, it comes down to thinking about what the management objectives are and what the species of interest are that you're trying to manage for. Don't know if that answers the question. But it's just to say, in terms of bumblebees, cutting time isn't quite as important as making sure the forage is available. So some species are going to be active all the way through to September, October, and so it's okay to cut in July as long as you're leaving margins and you're leaving maybe one field can be left uncut until September, and you rotate that around. So that's kind of, in terms of bumblebees, that's sort of how I would manage it.
Thank you. Is it possible to manage rose pasture without grazing?
Well, yeah, I think you can cut it. I know we did a project called the Nature Fund, and my neighbour will cut Ross hay for bedding, and he's now doing some stuff with cutting it to make compost. And the idea is to weaken the millennia and allow a lot more of the plants through and having a benefit of it. So they have been cutting on that hill for a number of generations, so it's quite nice to see. It can be, once you've sort of got it that it's not tussocky, it becomes easier to cut. It's when it's big and tussocky, it's more difficult to get machinery that's going to be able to cope, and if it's actually quite marshy and wet, then that can cause a little bit of damage as well. But I think stock do play quite an important part in that whole process of trampling it down and making it slightly higher and lower rather than just cutting a bit over the ground. So it's a bit of both, I think, but yes, you could do it as well for a short term.
So while we are on Molinia, would you say there are certain breeds that are better on grazing it, and how do you choose your breeds on your farm?
Yeah, I think obviously our farm, we can't particularly have sort of bulky breeds because they're quite heavy, so the more commercial breeds. So we have gone for traditional breeds, and any of the farms in the Ellen Valley, you will find there are Welsh Blacks, there are Highlands, there's Galloways. We've got the smaller type of the Hereford and the Shorthorn, which we have to manage them a bit carefully because if they're quite a milky cow, they're the old milky cows. If they get too much nutrition, they tend to be a bit troublesome when they calve because they've almost got too much milk. If that sound, you wouldn't think you'd be saying that, but yeah, so that they deal quite well on our sort of ground, a lighter type of cow as well. The only thing is, you've got these cattle that are on the Molinia and on the grasslands doing a good job, but of course when it comes to that they have to go to market, I suppose they can't really stand up the same against the commercial breeds, even though they've been grazing as naturally as possible. So hopefully that's something that we can sort of tap into the future, showing that that these animals do more and they're good to eat as well. So yeah, and as for the sheep, well, our Welsh mountain sheep survive very well. We did have Herdwick sheep, some of the toughest sheep, but they found it quite hard to survive in the Ellen Valley very well. They look quite thin. I think it's like some old man once said to me that the sheep you have are sort of they've been bred on that land for generations and they get what they need from the landscape. So obviously there's something in our landscape that doesn't suit the Herdwick sheep, but our Welsh mountains have been thriving for a long time. Maybe if the Welsh mountains went up to Cumbria, they wouldn't do very well up there either. So yeah, in an upland scenario, we need hardiness over everything. So, our sheep will only have usually one lamb, and that's all we want of them, to rear one good lamb on the hill, really. So yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting. The historical connections of breeds as well. I think, Gemma, you also mentioned the Achlean sheep as well, specifically grazing on Achlean. So there's a question for Gemma. You talked that bits on the Orme are too rank. So do the goats or sheep not keep these areas down? Are there less goats now?
Oh, okay. No, there are still goats there, and I completely forgot to mention them, so thank you for reminding me about that. No, the goats aren't sufficient to keep down the ranker areas, and Jan might be able to jump in here as well as to why that might be. I think there are some areas in the heathy sections that are quite gorse dominated, and in the grasslands it's ranker kind of coarser grasses that are causing the issues. And the goats don't seem to tackle those sufficiently anyway. And the goats are controlled. They have historically been controlled with contraceptives, which I believe is still ongoing. So the numbers are sort of limited to some extent. But no, Jan, maybe you want to come in on the goat grazing there.
Well, I think that the issue with the goats is that they don't eat the grassland vegetation very much at all. I mean, they tend to be a browser, so they go for the scrubby stuff. And actually, what they really like is people's gardens. So that's, they'll jump over the walls and the flean on the Orme, and they go into the gardens next door. And if any of you saw the pictures during lockdown, the first lockdown, of the goats in the middle of Llandudno High Street, that's where they headed for as soon as people weren't around, because there was lots of yummy gardens and trees and things. So they're not particularly good at grazing the grasslands like we want them to. And then the problem with the sheep, as I think Gemma said in her talk, is that the numbers have just reduced dramatically, particularly in the last 20 years. And so the vegetation has become so rank that even though the National Trust and Plant Life have got these two flocks up there is simply not enough to reduce the thatch which has built up over the last 20 years. So it is going to take some time to get that back down. So really, from the goat perspective, they're really impressive to see. They're amazing goats, but they're not actually doing very much of the habitat management.
They need a bit of training.
Yeah.
So we've got a question for Sinead. Since you said you are the specialist on herbalaise, is there do you need lots of different equipment when you are managing the herbalaise in terms of like the farmer equipment, or would it kind of coincide often with the cuts of if they're cutting for silage or cutting the margins, or do you kind of need to treat them separately and do extra cuts?
Not as far as I know from, so I wasn't the project officer on the Callum Wen project, so she might know better, but as far as I know, because the farmers we were working with are organic dairy farmers, so they were already using kind of legume rich seed mixes anyway. So as far as I know, there was no change in how they were doing things. They were just sort of changing seed mixes and trying out different seed mixes and leaving margins. The only thing that, and I think I mentioned in my talk, is that the only thing to flag up is if you're making silage from herbalaise, if you leave the chicory and it goes all kind of woody, then it can, I've heard it can kind of poke through the silage wrap. So that's something to just be aware of. But other than that, I don't know of any particular equipment or tools or anything that they needed to use.
Jan, there was a question about, you mentioned an interesting interaction with Chucks and Dung. Could you please expand on it a bit?
Okay, so I mean, chough are obviously insect-eating birds, and they rely heavily on invertebrates which use dung, including dung beetles, which are very important for them. So they're obviously impacted by ivermectins. And there's a lady down in Pembrokeshire, Dr. Benyon, I'm trying to think, is that the right name? I think I've got, who has the bug farm, who's done a lot of experimental work on dung beetles and the importance of chuff. And we know that cattle dung is actually much better. It supports a wider range of invertebrates. So you'll often see chuff feeding around dungy sites. They like things which we would think would look pretty awful. You know, it's covered in sheep dung or cattle dung, and it's really an important part of that habitat for them. So it is a problem if you have got grassland, even if you've got the height right, so they don't like it too high. But if you didn't have dung, you would have a reduction in the amount of invertebrates. So it's getting that balance and making sure. Dr. Sarah Benyon, someone's just put a Glenda, thank you, it's on the chat. Yeah, Dr. Sarah Benyon's at St David's. It's really worth looking at the Bug Farms website, because they do some really interesting stuff looking at particularly on dung beetles, and they actually do dung beetles by post, so you know you can buy dung beetles, but they are the really important part of the chuff's diet. So if there's no dung, then there's no dung beetles.
Mm-hmm. While we are on the coastal grassland as well, are there specific breeds that are more suited for the coastal grazing?
Again, I would, Emma's not on chat, is she? But you know, of the cattle, the ones we saw on the flean, one farm's using Herefords, but they're quite small Herefords, which is probably good. Like Sorcha says, you probably don't want big animals on these sort of habitats. The other one's using stabilizers, and has just had those out on the coast, and they seem to do well. I think Emma, she can tell me on chat if I'm wrong. I think you used your Dexters on the coast on the Gower, so they're okay. They're smallish breed, so I think you wouldn't necessarily go for the bigger breeds. You've often got really delicate soils on the coast, really thin soils, so you don't want something which is really heavy. But there are a number of those sort of more traditional breeds which would fit really well onto coastal grazing.
Thank you. There was a question about wax caps. I'm just going to read it out. No one has mentioned grassland fungi, in particular wax caps, thus being the European stronghold for habitat for red listed species. Are any of the speakers monitoring for wax caps? Heavy sheep graze pasture, fantastic, and lost opportunity to dispel the myth that woolly maggots are destroying our uplands.
I mean, yeah, no, that's obviously very important, and we didn't bring wax caps in, but some of these grasslands, for example, there's a massive grassland on the coast, where one of our coastal sites, which when we went back in the autumn, we realised was really important for wax caps, and that's both grazed by cattle and sheep. Actually, it has both animals on, and there's some really nice wax caps and other grass fungi on the upland margins, which are sheep grazed. So yes, it can be really important to make sure that grazing on those is right. I think the problem with wax caps grasslands is often they get missed because people aren't there at the right time of year, and of course the wax caps don't always have a fruiting body, so you can go for years without much above ground because it's underground, and people don't realise that it's actually an important wax cap site, and I think that is a real problem for us. I certainly know of a couple of wax cap sites which have been improved agriculturally because nobody realised that they were important. So it's really good to record wax cap sites. I think if you know them, talk to the Wildlife Trust in your area and actually make sure people are aware that there are important wax capped areas.
And just to add to that, for our project, actually, we are really trying to make sure that we will talk about wax caps as well, because they are part of Meadows and Grassland. So it's once the wildflower season stops, then the wax caps start in the autumn. So it's quite a nice progression. So there'll be definitely lots of wax cap talks in our project as well. And we did launch an app last year, which is called Wax Cap. And yeah, do please use it and spread word, because this is exactly what can help map them as well. And as Jan was saying, they often go unnoticed. So yeah, mapping app can help. Have we got any more questions? I think there was one for Sinead, talking about herbalaise. What is the reason then that farmers wouldn't use it? Because there seems to be so many amazing arguments for it that you listed. What would be kind of the main barriers you found?
I think probably there has been a bit of a barrier in terms of, obviously for farmers, they're running a business, and that's a potentially massive risk to totally change your, the seeds that you're using. So that's potentially been a barrier, and I think research is sort of showing that actually, it's still going to be a productive part of the farm system. I think there has been quite a big increase in farmers using them in recent years. I think the cost of the seed, I don't know how much more expensive it is than just ryegrass, white clover, but even ryegrass, white clover plus fertilizer, I think it possibly is cheaper than buying herbal ley seeds. So it's, perhaps that is one thing that puts farmers off as well. I don't know, I'm not really sure. There probably are other things, maybe around needing sort of training or increased knowledge of how to manage herbal leys. If there's any potential changes in how they manage their farm, then perhaps that's an aspect of it as well.
I think just to cut in there, I think it does normally. I mean, we've worked with a couple of farms on Flean where there's herbal leys, and normally it does mean a change to the grazing system if you're going to get the leys to work properly. And so, yeah, training and changing the farming system can take time. So I think that's why it's not adopted by everyone. I think people who I've met who have adopted it have been found it very positive. But it does take some thinking. It's not the same as just putting your stock out on a normal pasture.
Yeah, I think particularly, sorry, just to jump in, I agree. I think there's a tendency to use herbal leys, particularly for kind of mob grazing, and that's obviously a lot more, you have to be there every day, or maybe more than every day, moving fences along and grazing small parcels of land, and that, you know, for some farmers that would be quite labour intensive and quite a change to what they're already doing. So
thank you. I think we might have time just to squeeze the very last question that came in. Any thoughts or comments on the use of lime to manage grasslands, for example, controlling rushes, molinia?
Lime was that, did you say?
Yes.
I mean, I don't know about molinia and rushes, perhaps Sorcha could answer that, but in terms of hay meadows, then lime is really an important part of the hay meadow management. And one of the things we do see is many meadows now are underlimed. And I think actually that's been a problem in the Elan Valley meadows, is that there's a lack of liming, and you actually start to get a decrease in species diversity, and species like bracken come in. So whilst, you know, often we in nature conservation we say no liming, you know, we don't want lime, but that's on particular habitats, and there are many of our grasslands actually do need some lime in order to maintain that species diversity. So maybe Sorcha can say a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, sort of same as you really, Jan. We've spent a while trying to get answers. Do we need to lime them just from a conservation point of view, even, you know, nothing from sort of a production point of view? And that's actually quite a difficult thing to do. Of course, they're all designated, but they did have a traditional system of slagging and liming them in the past. So hopefully we've been working on a project with Farming Connect, have been involved in trying to get some answers if we need to. As for the molinia side of things, I mean, it's not even something we've discussed. I mean, I generally get the sense that I can't see any particular reason to do the molinia. I mean, there's been discussions on sort of where bracken is encroaching onto meadows. The liming might be beneficial to that, but I've not really had any discussions on molinia, because I don't know, it's a completely different habitat type, and it's nothing, I don't think it would benefit us really. And of course we're in a water catchment, so I know it has come up in the past with water companies, and I know they generally don't favour liming of molinia as a control method, but other than that I don't have any other info really.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. I think that's all we've got time for now. It's here a couple of minutes before the end. I'm not sure if it's just going to kick us out if we don't finish in time. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight to watch, but also again to our speakers, and especially to PONT for organizing everything and getting all the contributors ready. So thank you so much. I think we had really interesting questions as well tonight. I certainly learned a lot, really amazing selection of case studies. So hopefully everyone is feeling inspired and maybe having a go at a bit of conservation grazing. So quick recap. So this was the last part in a kind of mini series of 3 sessions. The first one, we had an introduction to conservation grazing, where we kind of mentioned all the practicalities about getting the conservation schemes running. Then in the second part, we went into detail on the specific breeds and how they can breed differently for the same outcomes. And now we kind of wrapped it up with this last session, talking a bit more about overall state, but a bit more specifically about different types of grasslands and how they are being managed. And also throughout the series, you could really see how conservation grazing can benefit so many different wildlife groups as well if it's done correctly. Besides the wildflowers and the hay meadows, we had a suite of case studies talking specifically about species like bumblebees, marsh fritillary, we had lapwings, we had chubs, we had amphibians and reptiles, whole suite of wildlife. So yeah, when it's done well, you can really make a massive impact to all sorts of different wildlife groups. So I hope that you enjoy the mini-series. There will be a really quick survey. I think it should just come up automatically when you close your sessions. So if you would like to just let us know how you like the sessions, and also if there is anything else that we can do to support you to really kind of make the next step for you to have a go at conservation grazing, please let us know what is it that you would need. Thank you very much again. I just wanted to say there will be follow-up emails going after this session, where we'll have all the links to previous recordings as well, including this one. And the sessions will be